In the 20th century, World War I was the defining turning moment in how world politics and diplomacy would be played for the rest of the 20th and 21st century. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, combined casualties of World War I, or commonly known as the Great War, were over 37 million men. For comparison, the most previous war to World War I was the Russo-Japanese War, and the Russians and Japanese combined lost 150,000 men. The politics leading up to the start of World War I are fascinating, but easily the most important role that the Great War had in shaping modern world politics was the way that it controlled diplomacy. World War I shocked humanity about the realities of modern war. In the 1880s, in the Russo-Japanese War, technology was simply outdated when World War I began in 1914. Artillery and machine guns had advanced at such an incredible rate that armies were left with wasting money on military equipment that would be outdated in 5 or 10 years. Never had that happened before in human history. Such impact and increase in military technology led to what we know now as called trench warfare, a life of shelling and machine gun fire that left thousands of men dead only to gain yards of territory on an enemy. A young officer in the British Army named Henry Macmillan, who would later become a British Prime Minister, explained to his parents in a letter home from the front lines. He said, "Perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the modern battlefield is the desolation and emptiness of it all. Nothing is to be seen of war or soldiers. Only the split and shattered trees and the burst of an occasional shell reveal anything of the truth. One can look for miles and see no human being, but in those miles of country lurk, like moles or rats it seems, thousands, even hundreds of thousands of men, planning against each other perpetually some new device of death." Battles raged on for longer than they have ever in human history, and more men were dying in short spans of time than ever before. For example, in the Battle of Verdun, the German and the French armies each lost 70,000 men a month for a battle that lasted 9 months. The brutal realities of World War I left world leaders looking for a permanent prevention to another war of this scale. Famous author H.G. Wells and also American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, both said that World War I would be the war to end all wars. President Wilson made it mandatory in the armistice talks at the Treaty of Versailles that Germany accept his 14-point plan before a treaty could be accepted. The goal of President Wilson's plan was to punish Germany for the war and set up a global agreement to attempt to avoid future wars. This led to the formation of what Woodrow Wilson would call the League of Nations. However, it became the precursor to the United Nations and was an attempt to avoid the vast web of alliances that led to the Great War. The harsh terms, though, of this armistice towards Germany, the weak powers that the League of Nations had, and a simple lack of involvement by a lot of important nations, even America at the time, would lead into World War II. The treaty had an utter lack of regard for German civilians and German economy at the time. It placed sole responsibility for World War I on Germany and forced German economic life into a severe depression. This depression was the basis for radical thinkers at the time to blame hardships on Jewish people, Gypsy people, and disabled people. Hitler would use this economic depression caused by World War I in order to stir the emotions of German people into another war. Harsh treatment of the German people also led leaders later on to appease Hitler as he moved into the Rhineland to Austria, Czechoslovakia, because they thought that the Germans had been mistreated at the end of World War I. Hitler was really just trying to gain back what had been unfairly taken from Germany after the end of the war. The utter failure of the League of Nations also contributed to World War II. Several countries just failed to join altogether, including the United States. And the League of Nations had no actual means for discouraging any violation of its peace agreements. There were no consequences for countries not settling their issues diplomatically instead of through military force. For example, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia was met by zero resistance from any other sovereign nation. The drastic improvement in military technology at the turn of the 20th century caused a war unlike the world had ever seen. Thousands of men's lives were sacrificed to gain every yard of territory. The change in military technology necessitated a change in diplomatic tactics as well, but those tactics did not work. Mass suffering caused by this war motivated most of the world to avoid any sort of similar conflict. The way countries interacted changed at the end of this unequivocal tragedy in human history.